Astrology is not a science. Astrology is not a religion. What astrology is a calendar. That's why every major civilization on the planet, whether it was Middle Eastern, Chinese, Indian, or Mesoamerican, created some form of astrology. It was in order to tell time. The Cosmic Calendar with me, Christopher Renstrom, is now open at astrologyhub.com/cosmic calendar. In the first chapter of the course, you will learn all about the history of astrology as a calendar in civilizations across the globe. In the second chapter, we'll cover the signs and seasons and why it's so important to know where the sun is in your birth chart. And in the third and final chapter, you will learn how to turn your birth chart into a personal calendar. For each chapter, there will be a live Q&A where you will have the opportunity to ask me your questions. And don't worry if you can't make it to the live sessions. You'll have access to the recordings within 24 hours. Go to astrologyhub.com/cosmic calendar. And Inner Circle members, be sure to check your membership portal for your own discount code. I am so looking forward to seeing all of you in class. Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And this week, I wanted to talk to you about Mercury entering the zodiac sign of Pisces on March 9th. Now, Mercury in Pisces is a unique placement. It's a unique placement because, in my opinion, there's nothing at all like it in the rest of the astrological chart. Where Mercury goes when it enters the zodiac sign of Pisces is very different, almost alien, from where it goes in the other 11 signs of the zodiac. And this is sort of emphasized or underlined, if you will, by the ancients' decisions regarding planetary dignity. Planetary dignity refers to particular zodiac signs where planets are most dignified or undignified, where they're most celebrated, or where they are just abysmal, they're fallen. And these regard to their states of power or ability to influence in the astrological chart. All planets in astrology, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, basically the 7 ancient planets, all of these 7 ancient or classical planets experience essential dignity or experience planetary dignity. That same idea doesn't really lend itself to the modern planets. There have been some attempts to try to come up with planetary dignities for them, but they don't really quite. But anyway, with the ancient planets, yes, the planetary dignities absolutely hold. Now, what makes Mercury in Pisces so exceptional is that if you follow Mercury's planetary dignity, you'll see that Mercury is in domicile or at home in the astrological signs of Gemini and Virgo. Okay, these are signs that are known for their communicative abilities. They can be very analytical. They can be very studied. They're good at problem solving. You know, these are basically the Mercury-ruled signs where Mercury is in domicile. Mercury is then in detriment, meaning not doing as well. It's not doing horribly, but it's not doing as well. Mercury is in its detriment in the opposite signs to Gemini and Virgo. And the opposite signs to Gemini and Virgo, of course, are Sagittarius and Pisces. These are the signs that are naturally ruled by Jupiter. And so Mercury is in detriment. It doesn't do as well in Jupiter-ruled signs. And that's a story in and of itself. Then we get into exaltations and falls. Okay, exaltations is when a planet is most celebrated, you know, where it's like, huzzah, this planet is most glorified, it's most exceptional, it's most celebrated in this particular zodiac sign. Okay, so exalted is like really special. Imagine staying at a 5-star hotel where it's all been paid for by somebody else and they treat you like royalty, and that is basically an exaltation, a planet that that is in its exaltation. A planet that is in its fall is basically a planet that was forced to stay at like a Motel 6 overnight. Okay, it enters the room. It doesn't really know like if it's been cleaned, who slept on this bed before. It's like, was I better off just sleeping in my car overnight or renting this room? You know, there's something about it that the planet is really like beyond not comfortable here. It's kind of like doesn't really want to be in the zodiac sign. Okay, so what's interesting with Mercury is that Mercury is exalted in the zodiac sign of Virgo. So Mercury is not only at home in Virgo, but it is exalted in the zodiac sign of Virgo. So people who've got Mercury in Virgo get a double bump on the scorecard, if you will. Okay, you're not only have Mercury at home or domicile in Virgo, but it's exalted in Virgo. So it's like it's really good at being clever and communicative and solving problems, figure its way out of having been painted into a corner in some way. If you want an example of Virgo and this type of thinking, I like to share a very famous Virgo, Agatha Cristie. Maybe you're familiar with her. Agatha Cristie wrote, I think Agatha Cristie wrote more crime mystery novels than anyone else on the planet. I think she's got like a Guinness World Book of Records, holding or something like this. She created Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot and wrote all of these wonderful crime mysteries. And the other reason why I sort of like to cite Agatha Cristie as a sort of example of a Mercury in Virgo or what we can expect with basically the Virgo and temperament in general, is that it's a very cunning mind. And so it's the idea of a mystery as a riddle that needs to be solved. Okay, you're going to follow these clues, you're going to pick up on these hints of things, and you're going to figure out that the footsteps led here and the dust on the table isn't completely over the table because there's really two thumbprints, and you're going to be able to deduce all of these clues and put together the fact that it was Colonel Mustard in the living room with the candlestick. Okay, so this is the sort of mystery solving that we see in Mercury ruled signs. All right, what's unique, and I always kind of find myself wondering what were they saying here? What's so unique about Mercury in Pisces is that Mercury is not only in detriment in Pisces. Okay, it's struggling in Pisces. It's having a difficult time in Pisces. Mercury is in fall in Pisces. So ancient astrologers really went out of their way to say, like, Mercury's really the worst it could possibly be in the zodiac sign of Pisces, which is kind of like, oh my God, like, what's up with that? Right? It's like, what do you have against Mercury and Pisces? I mean, they really had something against Mercury and Pisces. Mercury was not only in detriment in the zodiac sign of Pisces, it's in fall. So it's like, so this was the older astrologers' way of saying worst place ever, okay, was Mercury and Pisces, which of course, if I was someone with Mercury and Pisces, I would, be offended. I would be like, oh my God, like, what's the problem? Like, get over yourself or whatever. But this is what was decided, okay, that Mercury is in its absolute worst position in the zodiac sign of Pisces. Like, there's no argument, there's no discussion, there's no conversation. That is it. And so it leads one to sort of speculate, well, why? Like, what's so prohibitive? What's so verboten about Mercury and Pisces that it really has become the target of such ire? And the first thing that comes to mind when I think about it is that Pisces has a very different understanding of mystery than Virgo does. Okay, if we go back to the Agatha Cristie model, there's been a murder, a crime, or whatever. We need to solve this. Not only is there an expectation that the crime will be solved, okay, that there is an explanation and the crime will be solved. The adventure is in the solving of it. It's in uncovering those clues and then going back and gathering all the suspects in one room and walking them through, you know, the brilliance of the detective, and then exposing the criminal that everyone didn't think was the criminal. And there's lots of this sort of like pointing misdirection. You know, they think it's this one person and then another person and then finally it's, you know, Aunt B who did it with Aunt B, who's collected nothing but crockery over the years, or I don't know, something like that. I don't know where Aunt B came from, but anyway, like, it's Aunt B. Okay, and so she's like the villainess. She's, you know, the person who did this. Okay, what I'm really trying to say is that there is a solution that can and will be figured out, no matter how absurd or ridiculous the twists and turns. There is a puzzle that can be solved, and this is something which Mercury in its signs, and Mercury in most signs, really believes. It's really comfortable with this idea. Okay, that it can be figured out, and that it will be figured out. Not only can be figured out, it will be figured out. That is not the case of Mercury in Pisces. Not at all. In Pisces, a mystery isn't a whodunit. A mystery or mystery is an experience of the universe that is unfathomable. There is no explanation. It's not going to fit into easy to understand descriptions. What it leaves the person with when they've experienced this mystery is wonder. And oftentimes it's an awestruck wonder. Awestruck wonder means you're full of awe. You're moved profoundly by what you've witnessed, and there are no words. There are no words. There's no way that you could describe this if you tried. And there is even a sort of like unwillingness or a natural psychological reluctance to describe it, because you've been struck by this experience of awe and wonder. You've been struck by this experience of God, and it has left you speechless. It has left you with a reverberation. You can feel the presence. You know, something inside of you reacted to this larger you, and you know that there is a connection, that there is meaning, and that you are full of awe and wonder, and there is just no way that you could possibly explain that to another human being on the planet. And added to that is, if you try to, they're not going to believe you anyway. Okay, easy example is think of UFO abductions, which were happening, you know, on a regular basis. I think in the 1980s and 90s, everyone was getting abducted by a UFO or something like that, and people would come back and they would describe these sorts of things, and people were like, "You're crazy! I don't believe you." Or they would be in hypnosis. They would be in hypnosis and therapy, and all of a sudden, something that was about a submerged memory turned into a UFO abduction, you know, and all these sorts of things. And so people were like, "Oh my goodness, you're crazy," or whatever. But nevertheless, it moved like a ripple effect through society, through the world. People are like, there are UFOs. I mean, we had a television series, X-Files. The truth is out there somewhere. Okay, so there was still that sort of insistence that something could somehow be explained, but it was so far out there that it defied explanation. It defied language itself. So Mercury in Pisces has this kind of hallucinatory or this altered state flavor to it. But oftentimes, you know, it'll show up in astrology books and things like that as misinformation. You know, that if you have Mercury in Pisces, or you're under a Mercury in Pisces transit, that there's misinformation. And to there we go to George Orwell. He's always really reliable for these great phrases like doublespeak or memory hole. I love memory hole. It's so descriptive. It so says it. And of course, doublespeak in George Orwell's 1984 is saying one thing and then saying the contradictory thing in the same exact sentence. Okay, something we're used to with politicians on a regular basis. George Orwell Called it right. And then there's memory hole, which is whatever the history, the recorded history is, it's being thrown by Big Brother, or the agency of Big Brother down these chutes and shafts where it's burned, so that there is no history, there is no memory. People can't remember from one day to the next in this Orwellian society of 1984 what happened. You're at war with one country one week, and then you're at war with another country the next, and then you're best friends with the ones that you were at war with, and at war with an enemy, and then best friends with the enemy, and then at war with what used to be the friend. This sort of total shifting, and this has been ascribed or sort of served up as being examples of Mercury in Pisces. But I've done a lot of thinking about Mercury in Pisces, and what I keep sort of coming up with as this idea, like, why were they so insistent that Mercury was in detriment and in fall in the zodiac sign of Pisces? Why was this so anti-Mercurial, so anti-mind? And I think what it sort of gets back to, or something that came to my mind, was the whole idea of speaking in tongues. Speaking in tongues, I think we're familiar with here in the United States with Pentecostal churches, where someone is infused with the Spirit and they begin to speak, and it's completely gibberish. It doesn't make any sort of sense at all. But people in the room are struck with the presence of God, that this person has been possessed by a spirit, by a godly divine spirit, the divine itself, and it's trying to speak, and no one can understand that. So instead of people like, wow, I really don't get what, Bill's going on about, it's more like Bill is like possessed with the divine, and this is like extraordinary. Bill's like speaking in tongues. Okay. And so this experience itself is a holy experience. This experience itself is a testament to the divine. And what this speaking in tongues refers to is the Pentecost. I mean, it's Pentecostal churches because it refers back to the Pentecost. For those of you, in which Catholicism might be a little rusty, Christ rises from the dead on Easter, spends some time hanging out with the apostles. On the 40th day after he's risen from the dead, Christ ascends into heaven. The Christ full body just ascends, just rises up into heaven. There's some wonderful paintings of this with the apostles looking up, and they're around a mound, and on the mound are just like the footprints, and then like at the top of the painting are just like the feet of Christ as he's ascending up into the heaven. I forget who the artist is, but it's brilliant. I just love that painting. So on the 40th day, Christ ascends to heaven. On the 50th day after Easter, Christ has said, I will send the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to bless you. And on the 50th day, they're hiding, they're being persecuted by Romans, and they're hiding or having a secret meeting, secret mass. And all of a sudden there's this roar of wind, and these tongues of fire come down, and they land on the forehead of each apostle and the Virgin Mary. And they begin to speak in tongues. Okay, they begin to speak in tongues. They begin to speak in this language that no one can understand, because the idea of speaking in tongues actually is older than the Pentecostal church. It goes back to ancient civilizations. It's probably even older than ancient civilization. To be possessed by a spirit, a divine spirit, and to speak, and for it to be incoherent, was something that was really quite understood and created great marvel at. And so this is what takes place. And then the apostles then go out and it's ironic. They spread the word of God, but they're speaking in tongues, so they're spreading this word that's not being believed, and that people are finding foreign and alienating, and all these sorts of things, but this is their mission. This I find fascinating with the kind of Mercury in Pisces. It sort of helps to explain how Mercury and Pisces at times can have a sort of rambling or gibberish quality, and what it comes from, they're not like rambling or gibberish because they're speaking in tongues necessarily, but what it comes from is that Mercury and Pisces is very associative. One idea reminds them of another idea, which reminds them of another idea, and which reminds them of another idea. It's almost like at times they can be narrating a waking dream, because the mind is stream of consciousness. It's not an intellectual, these go in the boxes and definitions type of mind or speech, but it's almost like an unconscious stream of consciousness type of speech. But this brokenness, I find really intriguing and appealing when I think of Mercury and Pisces, this brokenness. And what that puts me back in mind of is the Adamic language. I don't know how many of you are familiar out there with the phrase the Adamic language. That's actually Adam, as in Adam and Eve, A-D-A-M, and then it's an adjective, I-C. Okay, so it's Adamic language. It's in reference to Adam. And it's in reference to Adam because there was this belief that before the fall of Adam, that Adam spoke the language of God. Okay, Adam. Some of the pieces that we have in Genesis is Adam is told by God or given permission by God to name all the animals and to name all the creatures. And I think that's basically about how in depth they get into it in the book of Genesis. Although in apocryphal texts and Gnostic texts and other texts, it gets much more Enochian texts, I think. It gets much more elaborate. Okay, but it's this idea that Adam could speak the language of God. And so in that essence, Adam had the power of God. God says, let there be light. Adam had this ability, let there be light. He could do this. Okay, this is all before the fall. Then that business happens with Eve and the serpent and the apple, and there's this fall. But one of the things that also falls here is the language, the language of God, the Adamic language, the language that Adam spoke before the fall is forever lost. Okay, it's shattered like glass. It's there's no way that you can possibly reconstruct it. There's no way that Adam could remember it. Okay, it's gone down the memory hole of George Orwell's 1984. Okay, so this language is lost. Okay, and so the Adamic language lives on as this kind of great pursuit. I think it was a pursuit by holy people and mystics and alchemists and magicians and all sorts of things down through the centuries. This pursuit for this great Adamic language that if you could speak, you could be in the presence of God. So even though we don't understand it when it comes up with something like speaking in tongues, nevertheless, the rhythms, the sounds, the fervor of it puts us in mind of the presence of God. Okay, so what I want to sort of share with you is here is a Mercury that is incoherent, that it's not making any sort of reasonable sense, but by its speaking, its uttering, it's putting people in the room, in the feeling, in the soul space of being present in the presence of God. Okay, this is the sort of idea. Now I'm going to go off on a kind of crazier tangent. What I like to sort of connect here, this broken language, this language that doesn't make sense, but you still respond to in a very soulful or very, very, very deep way. I was kind of liking the idea of Mercury and Pisces as being incoherent, and that incoherent is dangerous. Okay, so there's an incoherent, I don't understand this, but there's also sort of dangerous quality to it. There's what's being said, what's am I being cursed out in a foreign language or something like that? But what's being said with this language. And what it put me in mind of was actually the Dadaists and modernism, the modernist artists, and the surrealists. Now, Dada and modernism is late 19th, early 20th century. Then you've got Dada, which is the 19 teens, and then surrealism, which is following very much on the heels of that. And it put me in mind of them because basically these were artists who were coming from the assumption that language was broken, especially when you get into Dadaism, which was a visceral response to the horrors of World War I. Dadaists didn't try to paint paintings that depicted the horror of World War One, or anything along those lines. They went in the opposite direction. They took collages or worked with mixed media or mixed art form or whatever to really create these bewildering images. And these images were meant to strike people as being incoherent. And that was basically a lot of people's responses, which is like, Harry, what am I looking at? It's like, and one of the great examples here, of course, is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. And Nude Descending a Staircase sounds like, oh, like, let's take a look at that nude descending the staircase. And what it is this, I think it's based, maybe the idea is before silent movies, they had, film, and they would show images kind of like moving very slowly. And it's almost like Duchamp took the idea of each frame, almost like animated cells, and separated them to create this movement that almost seems clockwork or mechanical. But it's not a person, or it's a person that looks more like an automaton in this whirl of motion, but there's a sort of sterility of it. And maybe if you're lucky on a good day, you can make out the staircase. Okay, but what Duchamp was playing with here, I mean, there is a nude and there is a staircase, okay, but what Duchamp was playing with here was our expectations. We hear like nude descending a staircase and we're like, oh, let's see, and then our bewilderment, which is like, what am I looking at? Marcel. Okay, so there's this bewilderment, but that was the point. That was the point of the modernists and the Dadaists, which is this experience of horror of war, this experience of horror of where the world is going, because there's a prophetic quality to the Dadaists and modernists, which of course is also going to be wrapped up in Mercury and Pisces. There's a kind of like looking down the road, and they're saying, we're heading into a sort of nihilism or chaos in which words aren't going to hold. They're going to have mixed meanings. They're going to be dropped down memory holes and then repurposed to something else. And images are going to be the same thing too. Images are broken and mixed up together like collages, to really sort of underscore that the pieces of the puzzle don't fit. The world and civilization is broken. I mean, that's basically what they were saying, but they couldn't say, and this represents the brokenness of it, and you can find by the textures over here that there's really an ironic comment. No, they were defying the art critics and presenting something truly bewildering. They were presenting something truly inexplicable, something that sort of outraged the censors. It could slip past the censors because the censors didn't know what they were looking at, and it bewildered the public. But this plants the seeds for surrealism. It intrigues the public. All of a sudden, the public is like, what am I looking at? And why can I not walk away from this picture? And this is something that is then picked up by the surrealists. The surrealists, you're going to know them, Salvador Dali, Magritte. The surrealists are mixing images with each other. They're juxtaposing these absurdist images that absolutely don't make sense, but are astonishingly intriguing and beautiful. And what they were going for, what makes the surrealists different from everyone else, is that they were going for the unconscious mind. This is around the period that Carl Jung is writing about the collective unconscious. And so the surrealists are very much drawn to astrological imagery, occult imagery, tarot imagery, the mixing of medias and symbols. But here, what they're trying to do is communicate through the collective unconscious. Okay, so they're also picking up old totemic images from South Pacific civilizations, or African art becomes all the rage under Picasso and then transformed into Cubism. So there's this kind of drawing on the memory of our species and reworking it in such a way as to create this bewilderment in the person that's looking at. But instead of just Dadaist bewilderment, which could be kind of like fun and off-putting and clever and all these sorts of things, surrealism was actually trying to like move your unconscious, okay, into a direction like a dream, like a half-remembered dream from last night. And if you think of the way that we use the word surrealism in our day-to-day conversation, this is exactly what they were after, this kind of like moving of the dream imagery and moving of the unconscious, really the moving of the collective unconscious. So this I wanted to share with you as being another sort of variation on speaking in tongues, another variation on a broken language that we speak, but in its gibberish or in its stream of consciousness can actually link us up to something divine. What's interesting here is the defiance in interpretation. Okay, Mercury in Pisces, if we get into the sort of Dadaist thinking, surrealist thinking, there's a defiance of you cannot explain me and you cannot interpret me, but you can feel me. And that begins to enter into the whole idea of prophecy. What are the things that we always hear in prophecy, whether it's the Bible or Greek mythology or different? Prophets are never believed, okay? It's like they can go on about things or they speak in fantastical language, whether it's St. John the Divine or whether it's Nostradamus. They leave behind these fantastical images that we try to deduce or figure out what it is, and we're still like, huh? And so, but they speak in such a way that it's captured our imagination. It's spoken to our soul. We know that we're standing in the presence of something divine and unexplainable. And we're struck with awe and we're struck with wonder. So on one level, a Mercury in Pisces can confuse and it can confound. It can mislead and it can misdirect. It can maybe sound like someone is just, going on and on and on about things, or speaking gibberish, or things just don't make sense. But then on another level, Mercury in Pisces has an ability to access the symbolic realm, which is not the realm that we live in. And we can be struck and bewildered by that symbolic realm, but that symbolic realm can defy things like censors or critics or people trying to explain it. It can actually defy governments. It slips in underneath. And, surrealism was, anyway, that's a whole art history thing. But anyway, it can defy governments, because people can't really recognize or explain it, but yet you as a person can respond to it so powerfully. So I know that in some way, my description of Mercury in Pisces might annoy some people who are like, well, what's the point of it? Or, can't it be interpreted like a dream? Or, what's the point of just something that's incoherent or incomprehensible? And that's exactly why I would say to you, is the reason for Mercury being in detriment in Pisces and being in fall in Pisces, okay? Because it looks completely pointless. It looks completely incoherent. But for those of you who can look at a Dadaist work or a surrealist work, or for those of you who can stand in the presence of speaking in tongues, there's nothing like it. That something which is larger and more fantastical than you is reaching out across the divide, and that it is making its presence known. And this is the remarkable, hallucinatory, prophetic, surrealistic realm of Mercury and Pisces. And it's something that, try it on for the next couple of weeks that Mercury is here in Pisces. Try giving yourself over to the absurdist point of view of the universe. You might find that it's not to your taste, or you might find that it's speaking to you in ways that you never ever dreamed of before. And finally, Mercury leaves Pisces and enters the zodiac sign of Aries on March 27th.